I want to get your reaction first to what's been going on and what happened in Saudi Arabia, the Ukrainian agreement to unilaterally go into a ceasefire.
Well, Jose, I think Richard put it well. This is a positive step. It's a positive first step, in large part because it does flip the script. It puts the onus on the Russians for once during this administration, which is a good thing. But again, this is only a first step, and I mean that in two ways. In the first instance, of course, President Putin and the Russians ultimately have to accede to this proposal, and I think there are reasons to doubt that they will accede outright. But second of all, I think we need to think about this solely as an interim deal. And I say that because a frozen conflict, essentially freezing the front lines, is not the ultimate basis for a just peace, neither a just nor durable peace. And a just peace, in order for a peace to be just, it needs to make a clear distinction between victim and aggressor. It needs to make a clear distinction in this case between the Russians that precipitated this aggression and invasion in the first instance, and the Ukrainians, whose country has been destroyed, whose economy is in tatters, whose children have been kidnapped. Now, if this interim 30-day ceasefire can be built upon by the parties, and by the parties I mean the Ukrainians, the Russians, the Europeans, and the Americans, in order to look like something that more closely resembles a just peace, that ultimately will be a good thing. I think there are reasons to doubt we will see that, many of which will ultimately emanate from Moscow.
You know, and Ned, yet the fact that we are seeing what is, for the first time since the Russians invaded Ukraine, some possible movement. I mean, just the fact that Ukraine is interested in maybe a ceasefire, this whole joint venture with the United States that seems to be on hold. Yes, no, we don't know what that situation is like. But the fact that there is this movement, does it not give you hope?
Look, it does, Jose. I think certainly this is a good thing, and certainly it will be a better thing if it can be built upon as the basis for a just and durable peace. Now the ball moves to Moscow, and I think my skepticism is really born of what I expect we will see from Moscow. Look, Jose, I think it's quite unlikely that we will hear an outright no or niet from Vladimir Putin. And I say that because Putin recognizes that he has a very good thing going with President Trump in this White House, the thing he worked to ultimately achieve in 2016 and to varying degrees in 2020 and 2024. And he doesn't want to squander that entirely. I expect we'll hear something more like a yes, but from the Kremlin. And as always, the devil is going to be in the details. I think we need to be on the lookout for the Kremlin to say, essentially, we'll accede to this deal, but only if X, Y, and Z. And I think in that case, we need to remember that the White House certainly didn't give any incentives to Ukraine to agree to this to agree to this proposal. Quite to the contrary, they actually put pressure on Ukraine. And I think we need to be very wary of this White House's, I think, eagerness potentially give incentives to Moscow to agree to this. The deal should be what's on the table for Russia to agree to or to reject. I certainly hope they agree to it. I fear, however, they might do otherwise.
Yeah, and, you know, if history is a prologue, I think that in
Meanwhile, it's been 3 years since the war in Ukraine began. Now the United States is hoping to bring Russia and Ukraine on the same page and put in place a ceasefire. Talks between America and Ukrainian officials in Saudi Arabia and Jeddah ended with Ukraine agreeing to an immediate 30-day ceasefire. The Kremlin, though, is yet to react in a way that would give hope. It is being extremely cautious at the moment. But the big question is, will Putin agree to the terms that were agreed upon without Russia being at the negotiating table? In fact, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said now the ball is in Putin's court. And Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle East envoy, will be in the Kremlin as early as later this week. So, will Putin agree? And if he doesn't, what happens next? I delve a little deeper. Ukraine has expressed its willingness to support an American proposal for a temporary ceasefire with Russia. This marks a significant step after extensive discussions in Saudi Arabia. These talks culminated in an agreement by the United States to resume military aid and intelligence sharing with Kyiv, both of which had been suspended following a tense meeting between US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House back in February, which led to a full-blown diplomatic meltdown. The negotiations were held in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, under much calmer circumstances and a much calmer environment. It was a bid to reinvigorate the effort to establish a 30-day ceasefire, which had been stalled because of previous disagreements. The Trump administration had halted both military assistance and intelligence.
It seems to be increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for Russia to take all of the 4 provinces that they have notionally annexed nearly 2 years ago now, of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. They have most of Luhansk. They have probably 2/3 of Donetsk, maybe 3/4 of Zaporizhia, maybe 3/4 of Kherson, roughly. Now, could they demand, give us the rest or we won't have a ceasefire? Again, very hard for them to press that. So I just don't see a ceasefire that would involve anything less than a freezing of the front line roughly where it is now, with each side saying that they don't fully accept the outcome, but are willing to stop fighting.
After 9 hours of talks in Jeddah, Ukraine has accepted a US plan for an immediate 30-day ceasefire with Russia. In a joint statement, the US said it would immediately resume intelligence sharing and security assistance to Ukraine, and it seems this is already happening. Well, this all represents a significant change in relations between the US and Ukraine after President Zelensky's meeting with President Trump at the White House descended into an acrimonious shouting match. So Keir Starmer has congratulated the two leaders on a remarkable breakthrough and said Russia must now agree to a ceasefire and an end to the fighting too. Speaking after the talks, President Zelensky's Chief of Staff, Andriy Yermak, called on Russia to back the ceasefire plan.
Russia needs to say very clearly, they want peace or not. They want to end this war, which they started or not. And this is today the position of Ukraine was absolutely clear. It's absolutely understandable. And now it's important that the people in the world will understand, because this war, it's created the many crises.
Well, President Trump has said he'll take the plan to the Russians. He hopes to meet President Putin this week.
Now we have to go to Russia and hopefully President Putin will agree to that also, and we can get this show on the road. We can get this horrible war where 2,000-3,000 soldiers a week, every week, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 sometimes. I get the reports. And they're not American soldiers. They're Ukrainian and they're Russian. But people are being killed outside of that. People are being killed in the cities as things explode throughout the cities. And we want to get that war over with.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the progress in talks between Ukraine and the United States. We must now redouble our efforts to get a lasting, secure peace. Mr. Speaker, on Saturday, I'll convene international leaders to discuss how we can make further progress. Can I also pay tribute to the bravery and dedication of all those responding to the ship collision off the East Yorkshire coast? Our thoughts, and I'm sure of the whole House, are with the family of the crew member who is sadly presumed dead.
Will the Prime Minister confirm to the House that British peacekeeping troops will only be deployed to Ukraine if the peacekeeping deal includes both the return of Ukraine's children and Putin's prosecution?
Well, Mr. Speaker, firstly, I thank you for raising this issue because it is an absolutely terrible case of abduction and kidnapping. And when we say a lasting, just settlement or peace in Ukraine, it must, of course, involve dealing with this issue, and we are, as he would expect, raising it continually with our allies.
So will the Prime Minister fly out to Canada as soon as possible to show their new Prime Minister and the Canadian people that Britain stands with its Commonwealth allies against Trump's threats and against Trump's tariffs?
Well, Canada is an ally, and a very important ally too, and I've spoken to our allies on many occasions about the situation in Canada. On the question of tariffs, obviously, like everybody else, I'm disappointed to see.
As of this morning, the United States is applying a 25% tariff on imports of steel and aluminum. We deeply regret this measure. Tariffs are taxes. They are bad for business and worse for consumers. They are disrupting supply chains. They bring uncertainty for the economy. Jobs are at stake. Prices up. Nobody needs that on both sides, neither in the European Union nor in the United States. The European Union must act to protect consumers and business. The countermeasures we take today are strong but proportionate. As the United States are applying tariffs worth $28 billion, we are responding with countermeasures worth 26 billion euros. This matches the economic scope of the tariffs of the United States. Our countermeasures will be introduced in 2 steps, starting with April 1st and fully in place as of April 13th. In the meantime, we will always remain open to negotiations. We firmly believe that in a world fraught with geo-economic and political uncertainties, it is not in our common interest to burden our economies with such tariffs. We are ready to engage in a meaningful dialogue